Of the 153 destroyers the Royal Navy lost during the Second World War, 72 were sunk in a single theater in less than 3 years. Not the North Atlantic, not the Pacific, the Mediterranean, a body of water 2,300 miles long and nowhere more than 1,000 miles wide, encircled by enemy air bases and seeded with submarine patrol areas and swept by the Italian fleet and the Luftwaffe, operating from Sicily and the Regia Aeronautica, operating from Sardinia and the German surface units operating from every occupied port between Toulon and Tripoli. The Mediterranean consumed Royal Navy destroyers at a rate no other theater matched, because the Mediterranean was the theater where Britain had the least margin, where the supply line to Malta ran through waters the enemy could reach from every direction, where the evacuation of Crete required ships to enter waters that shore-based air completely dominated, where the operational demands never paused long enough for the force to reconstitute what the previous week had cost it. The Admiralty called the Mediterranean the vital theater. The men who served there called it a number of things, none of which appeared in official documents. But the Mediterranean was only where the losses concentrated. The service itself spread across every ocean the war opened and imposed conditions on the men who performed it that the Admiralty's language of shield of the fleet and senior service and Britain's maritime tradition had not described and was not designed to describe. A Royal Navy destroyer rating in 1941 earned approximately £2 and 5 shillings per month. He slept in a hammock that he slung from hooks above the mess table and stowed rolled in a net at Reveille. He ate food his mess cook prepared from raw provisions issued from the ship's galley, in a mess of 15 men who shared one table and the space adjacent to it for every function of their daily lives. He bathed in facilities that the ship's water allocation permitted access to, when the water allocation permitted it, which was not always. He stood his watches in weather that the Royal Navy's operational requirements placed him in, regardless of what the weather was doing, which in the North Atlantic in winter and the Mediterranean in every season was weather the pre-war doctrine had classified as operationally acceptable, and that the men standing it experienced in the specific physical terms of their own bodies, in that weather, on that watch. This was what the Admiralty's tradition called service. Here is what the men who performed it called it when they wrote home, in the letters the censors reviewed before allowing them to pass. Start with the ship, because the Royal Navy's destroyer fleet in 1939 was not a uniform force, and the gap between its most capable modern vessels and the oldest ships still in commissioned service was wide enough that serving in a tribal-class fleet destroyer and serving in a V-class veteran of the First World War were not the same experience in any dimension that mattered to the men living the difference. The tribal-class destroyer, the most capable surface combatant in the Royal Navy's destroyer inventory at the war's opening, displaced 1,870 tons at standard load and 2,519 tons fully loaded for war. She measured 377 feet from stem to stern and 36.5 feet at the beam. Her main armament was 8 4.7-inch guns and 4 twin mountings, supplemented by 4 21-inch torpedo tubes in a single quadruple mount. Her twin Parsons geared turbines developed 44,000 shaft horsepower, which drove her to a designed maximum speed of 36.5 knots. She was, by any contemporary measurement, a capable and formidable warship. The Royal Navy commissioned 16 tribals between 1938 and 1939. Of those 16, 12 were sunk during the war. That is a destruction rate of 75% from the class that represented the pinnacle of British destroyer design at the conflict's start. The V and W class destroyers that filled the fleet's numbers were older ships by 15 to 20 years and smaller by a significant margin. A V class displaced approximately 1,490 tons, measured 312 feet, and could make 34 knots in her trial condition of 1918, a condition that 2 decades of service, 2 refits, and the accelerated maintenance cycles of wartime operations had moved away from in ways the ship's commanding officers reported with increasing frequency in their operational readiness assessments. These were the ships that formed the majority of the escort force in 1939 and 1940, that ran the Atlantic convoys and the Channel patrols and the Norwegian operations, that were sent to do everything the fleet needed a destroyer to do, because they were what the fleet had. The forward mess deck on a V-class destroyer was the primary living space for between 40 and 50 junior ratings. The seamen, stokers, electrical artificers, ASDIC operators, and torpedo men who formed the bulk of the ship's company. It occupied a space in the bow of the ship, below the main deck, approximately 30 feet long and 16 feet wide at its widest point, tapering toward the stem as the hull's lines drew together. Into this space went the mess tables, the mess lockers where the section's food stores were kept, the hammock hooks fitted to the deckhead at the spacing the naval store's specification required, and the 40-odd men who lived in it. The hammock issue that the Royal Navy maintained through the Second World War, the regulation hammock, stowed rolled in the hammock netting above the main deck during the day and slung from hooks below the deckhead at night, was not the antiquated tradition that it appeared to peacetime observers. It was the solution to a space problem that no fixed bunk arrangement could have addressed in the volume available. A hammock occupied its allocated deck space only when occupied. A fixed bunk occupied its allocated deck space permanently. On a V-class destroyer with 40 men in the forward mess, the difference between the hammock system and a fixed bunk system was the difference between a mess deck that was livable during the day and one that was not. This logic was clear. The practical experience of sleeping in a hammock slung 18 inches from the man above you and 12 inches from the man beside you on a North Atlantic passage in force 7 conditions, with the bow pitching through 12-foot swells that the hammock's pendulum response amplified rather than dampened, was not addressed by the logic. The bow compartment was the worst position on a destroyer in a seaway. Physics placed the greatest motion there, the greatest vertical acceleration as the bow rose to the wave, the greatest impact as it came down. The junior ratings who occupied the forward mess were junior because seniority governed berthing allocation in the lower deck hierarchy, and seniority had moved aft to better positions. A man who had been in the ship for 2 years slept in calmer water than the man who had joined 3 months ago. The hierarchy was real, and the physical difference it produced was measurable in the quality of sleep the men in each position could achieve. Sleep on a Royal Navy destroyer in the North Atlantic was not rest in any sense the word implies when used in peacetime. The watch system rotated men between 4-hour on and 8-hour off periods, which meant that the 8 hours of theoretical off-watch time was available at different hours of the day and night, depending on which watch section a man belonged to and where in the rotation the ship was at any given moment. The 8 hours were further reduced by the meals that had to be prepared and eaten, the maintenance that could not be deferred to port, the damage control drills that the regulations required at specified intervals, and that the operational situation occasionally required at unspecified ones, and the general quarters alarms that the threat environment in contested waters generated regardless of where the watch rotation stood. In the North Atlantic in 1941, a destroyer escorting a convoy across from Halifax to Liverpool averaged between 90 minutes and 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep per 24-hour period during periods of sustained U-boat contact, when the ASDIC operators' detections brought the ship to action stations repeatedly through nights that the U-boats exploited because darkness was their primary tactical protection. The Naval Aviation Medicine studies that the Royal Navy's Institute of Aviation Medicine extended to surface warfare by 1943 documented these figures against the physiological standards for sustained human performance, and arrived at conclusions that the operational tempo made impossible to act on. The men who stood those watches and got those hours of sleep continued anyway, because the convoy had to reach port, and the escort had to provide it. The specific physical conditions that the North Atlantic imposed on Royal Navy destroyer crews through 5.5 years of convoy escort and fleet operations require their concentrated examination here, because the North Atlantic was the primary operational environment for the largest portion of the Royal Navy's destroyer force, and because it produced a form of sustained physical hardship that had no equivalent in any other theater the war opened. The North Atlantic in winter generates sustained gale conditions, force 8 and above on the Beaufort scale, meaning wind speeds between 34 and 40 knots and wave heights averaging between 6 and 8 meters, with individual waves exceeding 11 meters in fully developed storm seas, for periods measured in days rather than hours. A destroyer of 1,490 tons displacement is not a stable platform. She is a vessel spending a significant fraction of every hour in conditions that exceed her designed sea state for normal operations, whose crew is managing equipment and watch responsibilities and ship handling on a deck that is pitching and rolling and yawing simultaneously in combinations that the ship's stabilizers, fitted on some classes and not others, could reduce but not eliminate. The seakeeping of the V-class destroyers in North Atlantic winter conditions was documented by every commanding officer who took them to sea in those conditions with a candor that the formal language of official reports could contain, but not conceal. They were wet. The term in the Royal Navy's operational reports referred specifically to the amount of water that came aboard over the bow and along the main deck in heavy weather, water that found its way below through every imperfect seal, that ran down the inside of the bridge structure and into the wheelhouse, that soaked the hammocks in the forward mess when the bow went into a wave and the shock transmitted through the hull opened the micro gaps that decades of use had created in every fitting. The forward mess deck of a V-class destroyer running in Force 8 was not a dry space. It was a space where the degree of wetness was a function of how bad the weather was and how long it had been bad, and the degree varied between damp and soaked and beyond soaked to the specific condition where the distinction ceased to matter, because everything was already at maximum saturation. You adapted to being wet. Adaptation was not dryness, it was the cessation of caring about wetness as a separate condition on top of everything else. The food that a destroyer rating 8 at sea was determined by the same mess cook system that the battleship operated under, with the specific addition of the destroyer's sea motion as a constant constraint on what could be prepared and what could be kept in the mess lockers without spoiling. The galley on a V-class destroyer was a single space with a range that fed the entire ship's company through multiple sittings, operated by a cook who managed the preparation of hot meals in sea states that made cooking a physical challenge beyond its culinary one. In moderate conditions, hot food was reliable. In Force 8, hot food was an achievement. In sustained North Atlantic gale, hot food was a theoretical possibility that the actual conditions frequently prevented from being realized, and the men ate whatever could be prepared without cooking, in whatever position they could brace themselves to eat it. The ASDIC, the Royal Navy's designation for the active sonar system that was the primary submarine detection tool aboard escort vessels, was operated by a ratings specially trained in its use, who sat in a compartment adjacent to the bridge that was specifically designed for the acoustic isolation required to hear the faint echoes that a submerged submarine returned. The ASDIC operator wore headphones that gave him the transmission pulse and the return, and he interpreted what he heard against the background noise of the sea and the ship's own machinery, identifying contacts, classifying them as submarine or non-submarine, tracking their bearing and range and movement, and reporting to the bridge officer who decided what to do with the information. This was the function the doctrine described. The function as performed differed from the doctrine in ways that any honest accounting of what British destroyer service required must address. An ASDIC operator who had been at sea for 12 days on a convoy escort, who had stood his watches in the rotation his watch section schedule produced, who had slept in the accumulated periods that the 12 days had generated at the average that sustained convoy operations and U-boat contact areas generated, was operating the fleet's primary submarine detection instrument at a physiological margin that the Naval Intelligence Division's 1943 assessment of ASDIC operator performance described in terms that the operational command would not have found comfortable reading if the operational command had been given the time to read it. Contact discrimination, the trained judgment that distinguished a submarine echo from a school of fish, a thermal layer, or any of the other acoustic phenomena that the North Atlantic's biology and physics produced, degraded measurably at sleep deficit levels that convoy escort operations routinely produced in ASDIC crews. The assessment documented this. It recommended minimum rest intervals between ASDIC watch periods. The operational tempo made the recommendations impossible to implement consistently. The contacts that were missed, the submarines that attacked convoys whose escorts had been unable to locate them, were not all the product of operator error in the simple sense. Some were the product of men doing their best at a skilled and critical task in the physiological condition that the service had placed them in. The operation that reveals most completely what the Royal Navy's destroyer service in the North Atlantic actually cost, in concentrated human terms, is not a single battle. It is a 3-night period in March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic's critical climax, when convoy HX-229 and convoy SC-122 were simultaneously attacked by 40 U-boats in the North Atlantic and lost 21 merchant ships totaling 141,000 tons. The escorts defending both convoys included destroyers whose crews had been at sea in the North Atlantic for periods that the watch logs document without describing. HMS Volunteer, an ex-American four-stacker transferred under the 1940 agreement, was escort commander for HX-229 during the worst night of the attack. She had been at sea for 11 days when the main U-boat attack developed on the night of March 16th. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Gordon Luther, directed the escort's response to multiple simultaneous submarine contacts across a night that the action report describes in the clipped language of official documents, bearings, times, depth charge patterns, course changes, without capturing the bridge conditions, the temperature, the sea state, or the condition of the men who had been managing the ship and the watches through 11 North Atlantic days. Volunteer sank 1 U-boat during the operation. She lost 4 merchant ships from the convoy she was escorting, despite this. The arithmetic of that night, and of the entire HX-229 and SC-122 battle, was the arithmetic that Admiral Donitz read as his force's greatest success of the war, and that the Admiralty read as the closest point the Battle of the Atlantic came to being lost. The men on the escorts read it the way men read the specific night when everything they were doing proved insufficient for what was happening around them. 3 months later, in May 1943, improved convoy escort tactics, increased air cover from very long-range aircraft, new anti-submarine weapons, and the intelligence advantage that Bletchley Park's Enigma decryption provided combined to shift the battle's arithmetic decisively. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were sunk. Donitz withdrew the main U-boat force from the North Atlantic. The crisis passed. The men who had been on the escorts through the crisis years, through 1941 and 1942 and the first quarter of 1943, did not receive official acknowledgement of this transition in terms that addressed what the transition had cost them specifically. The battle had turned. The strategic situation had improved. The operational requirements continued, because U-boats continued to operate in reduced numbers and the convoys continued to require escort. The watch rotations continued. The North Atlantic continued. The specific incident that reaches into the center of what Royal Navy destroyer service costs in the most human terms is HMS Harvester on the night of March 11th, 1943. 3 days before the HX-229 assault reached its climax. Harvester was an H-class destroyer commissioned in 1939, 1,340 tons, 323 feet, 4 4.7-inch guns, 8 torpedo tubes, a crew of approximately 175 men. She had been running North Atlantic convoy escorts since 1940. On March 11, 1943, she was the senior escort with convoy HX-228 when she gained an ASDIC contact and began a depth charge attack on U-432. The first attack brought U-432 to the surface. Harvester's commanding officer, Commander A. Tate, closed to ram. Harvester struck U-432 and rolled her under. The German submarine sank. In the collision, Harvester's bow was damaged and her port propeller shaft fouled by wreckage from U-432. She lost speed. She lay stopped in the North Atlantic while her engineering department attempted to clear the shaft and restore propulsion. At approximately 10:07 on March 11th, the German submarine U-444, which had been in the vicinity and had observed the engagement, torpedoed the stopped Harvester. The explosion was in the engine room. The ship broke in two within minutes. Both sections sank. The Free French corvette Aconit, which arrived on the scene shortly after, sank U-444 and then began rescue operations. She recovered 61 survivors from Harvester's crew. Commander Tate was not among them. He had been on the bridge. Of Harvester's company of approximately 175 men, 114 were lost. The men who went into the North Atlantic on March 11, 1943, from a ship that had been stopped in a U-boat operating area after a ramming action that had damaged her propulsion, entered water at approximately 7 degrees Celsius. At 7 degrees, the time available for survival without a survival suit, which was not standard equipment for destroyer crews in 1943, was between 30 and 90 minutes, depending on the individual's physical condition and the specific circumstances of their immersion. A Connaught's arrival brought rescue within the window that some of the men had available. For others, the 30 minutes had already passed before rescue reached them. The men who died in the North Atlantic on March 11, 1943, from HMS Harvester, are recorded in the casualty lists of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Their names are there, their ages are there, their service numbers are there. What is not there is what the North Atlantic at 7 degrees Celsius feels like after 30 minutes, or what it costs to hold a shipmate's head above water in that temperature while waiting for a corvette to arrive, or what it means to be recovered from that water and informed after you have been given dry clothing and hot soup and something to sit on, that you have been assigned to another escort vessel that will be sailing on its next convoy in 48 hours. The man who survived HMS Harvester and received that assignment and sailed 48 hours later was performing the function the Royal Navy required of him. He was also performing it in the specific physiological and psychological condition that being in the North Atlantic for 30 minutes in March after watching his ship break in two had left him in. There was no alternative assignment. The escorts had to sail. The convoys had to cross. The Battle of the Atlantic required what it required, and what it required was not bounded by what the men who provided it had been through in the preceding 48 hours. The hearing damage from sustained destroyer operations, from the 4.7-inch guns firing, from the depth charge explosions at the ranges that effective anti-submarine prosecution required, was universal among destroyer veterans in every theater. The 4.7-inch gun of a Royal Navy destroyer in the twin-mounting configuration produced muzzle blast over pressure at the adjacent positions that the naval gunnery specifications permitted, but that the medical literature's standards for safe sustained exposure did not. Destroyer crews fired their guns in combat without adequate hearing protection because the tactical requirement for verbal communication made wearing adequate hearing protection incompatible with performing the job. They fired the guns. They lost hearing by increments that the ambient noise level of a destroyer at sea normalized against, and they noticed the cumulative loss only when the noise was gone. The cold injury from North Atlantic operations in the older ships without adequate heating, the V and W class veterans whose heating systems had been designed for conditions the North Atlantic did not consistently provide, showed up in the post-war health records of men who had served in these ships in patterns that the Veterans Medical Services processed as routine because the association between North Atlantic destroyer service and chronic peripheral cold injury was well established enough to be recognized without requiring individual proof. And the other thing, the thing the post-war surveys called battle fatigue, and that the men themselves described, when they described it at all, in the language of specific sounds and specific sensations that did not leave. One of those men was able seaman William Dodds of HMS Harvester, from Sunderland in County Durham, 23 years old, on the night of March 11, 1943. Dodds was a member of Harvester's ASDIC team. He was below decks when U-444's torpedo struck. The explosion in the engine room produced a shock through the ship's structure that he described in a welfare interview conducted at Liverpool Naval Hospital on March 15, 1943, one of the relatively rare instances where a formal welfare assessment was conducted on a survivor before reassignment. As different from depth charge shock in a specific way, he could not articulate beyond saying it came from inside rather than outside. He was in the water for approximately 25 minutes before Akinet reached him. The water temperature on March 11th in that position was 7 degrees Celsius. He was hypothermic when recovered. He was treated at Liverpool Naval Hospital for 4 days. On March 15th, the welfare officer who conducted the interview noted in his report that Dodds appeared physically recovered, was alert and responsive, demonstrated no obvious signs of acute psychological disturbance, and expressed willingness to return to destroyer duty. The welfare officer's report recommended reassignment to destroyer service after a minimum of 2 weeks shore leave. Dodds received 4 days. He served on 2 subsequent destroyers through the remainder of the war, completing the Atlantic campaign and the Arctic convoy operations of 1944. He returned to Sunderland after the war and worked for 34 years in the shipyards on the Ware, building the ships that peacetime required in the yards that the war's demand had expanded and that the post-war contraction progressively reduced. He retired in 1979. He died in 1994 at the age of 74. His daughter, in an account deposited with the Sunderland Local Studies Library in 2003, described her father as a man who worked in ships his whole life without being comfortable on the water. She said he had been on the Ware every working day for 34 years and had never expressed the relationship with the water that she would have expected from a man who had spent 5 years in the Navy. She said he treated the river the way you treat something you have a complicated history with attention and without warmth. She said she found after his death, in his workshop, a small notebook. It contained 2 entries. The first was a list of names. The men from Harvester's company who had not been recovered by A. Connet on March 11, 1943. He had written the list on March 16, 1943, one day after the welfare interview, the day before he was reassigned. There were 114 names. The second entry was dated August 15, 1945, the day the war ended. It was 1 sentence. He had written, "These are the ones who did not come home from the same ship I came home from." Nothing else? He had kept it for 49 years. Did anyone in your family serve on a Royal Navy destroyer during the Second World War? Drop their story and vessel in the comments. Let's make sure they're remembered.